Hello everyone, this is the second lecture for a second chapter from part 1, which is dual effect of transactions and types of accounts. Yes, and in order, this is the 10th lecture for this subject. The subject accountancy, and of course this is Payal ma'am, your accountancy teacher. I have already taught you chapter 1, which is accounting and its terminology, and from the previous lecture we have started second chapter, that is dual effect of transactions and types of accounts. So let us quickly revise whatever we have done so far. Yes, we have understood about transaction, that it should be business transaction, it should be measured in terms of money. The transaction can be cash transaction or credit transaction and economic transaction. Yes, and its types. We have understood about a cash transaction, credit transaction and other transactions. Yes, in cash transaction we have understood about cash transaction of goods, cash transaction of service, cash transaction of receivables and payables, and cash transaction of an asset. Then we have understood about credit transactions. Yes, that what a credit transaction is. Yes, then we have also understood about other transactions, the transactions which do not appear in the category of cash transaction, or a credit transaction falls under the category of other transaction. Yes, so now we are going to talk about the internal transactions and external transactions. Yes, so talking about the internal transactions. What are internal transactions? Firstly, what is a transaction? An exchange of goods or services in terms of money to be a business transaction. Now, in economic transaction, what is an internal transaction? Yes, a transaction in which the third party is not involved. Yes, I repeat, transaction in which third party is not involved is an internal transaction. Say for example, depreciation. Depreciation. You know this very well. I have explained this in the previous chapter, what depreciation is. Yes, depreciation is the reduced balance, right? The value of an asset that decreases every year is termed as depreciation. Now, asset belongs to business. The value decreased is termed as depreciation. Yes, so this comes under the category of internal transaction. And the other example given here is loss due to natural calamity. Any sort of natural calamity that takes place and the loss arises out of it to the business comes under the category of internal transactions again. Yes. Now talking about external transactions. Yes, what is an external transaction? Transaction for purchase of goods. Yes, from whom we are going to purchase goods? From the third party, from an outsider. Yes, so that becomes an external transaction. The transactions that take place with third parties, with outsiders. Yes, who are the outsiders? The one who are not a part of your business, the one with whom you are trading, right? Not internally. Yeah, so external transactions You have several examples given in your textbook. These transactions are between business and other parties. Other parties, these are the third parties. These are economic transactions of business. Of course, they can be measured in terms of money. These transactions are recorded in the books of accounts, and the examples given are sale of goods to customers. You are selling goods to your customers is an external transaction. Customer is an external party, third party. Yes. Payment of wages to workers, interest received from bank, etc., etc. These are all external transactions. Yes. So here we finish the understanding of the types of economic transactions. Cash, credit, other transactions, internal transactions, external transactions. These are all economic transactions. The one having some economic value or monetary value. Yes. So now talking about non-economic transactions. Yes. The chart that we have understood in the previous lecture had two types. The types of business transaction I am talking about. It was economic transactions and non-economic transactions. Yes, we have understood in detail about economic transactions. Now we are going to understand what non-economic transactions are. Completely opposite to economic transactions. A transaction that cannot be measured in terms of money fall under the category of non-economic transactions. Alright, I repeat, a transaction that cannot be measured in terms of money is said to be a non-economic transaction. Simply speaking, a transaction in which money is not involved, or the transaction which does not have any economic value, is a non-economic transaction and cannot be recorded in the books of accounts. Yes, only economic transactions, business transactions, in that economic transactions can be recorded in the books of accounting. Alright, fine then. So now that we have understood the topic of economic transactions and non-economic transactions, yes, let us proceed with the practical example that is given to you in your textbook. That is illustration 1, the very first illustration of this chapter. What you are supposed to do is that you are only supposed to classify them as economic transaction or non-economic transaction. That's all. Yes? You just have to say that whether the transaction, the given transaction, is economic or is non-economic. Yes? How will you classify? A transaction having economic value, you will say it is economic, and the transaction which does not have economic value is non-economic transaction. Yes? So let us quickly start. Illustration 1 in your textbook, page number 26. It says, describe whether the following transactions are economic or non-economic transactions and clarify the reason for it. You also have to mention the reason that why it is economic and why it is non-economic. Yes? Starting with the first transaction that is given, it says assets purchased for rupees 10,000. We have started with illustration 1 and we are going to categorize the transactions as economic transactions or non-economic transactions. The very first step for identification of transactions. So yes, illustration 1. Yes, what we are supposed to do? We are supposed to describe whether the transaction is economic or is non-economic. Yes, okay. The first transaction, assets purchased for rupees 10,000. Okay. An asset is purchased for how much? Rupees 10,000. So assets, an asset is purchased, 10,000 is given in exchange. Yes. So this is an economic transaction because the transaction is having monetary value. Economic value of transaction is rupees 10,000. Alright. Okay. You have an explanation given to you in the very next page. On page number 27, there is a table prepared. Transaction, then it says economic or non-economic, then it gives the reason. Yes. The very first transaction, as I said, is an economic transaction. If you remember, this is an economic transaction and this is the cash transaction of an asset that we have understood in previous lecture. Yes, we have understood this in detail in previous lecture. Yes, this is the cash transaction of an asset. Yes. Reason, cash is paid against asset. Yes, asset is purchased, cash is given. So this is an economic transaction. This way you have to categorize the different transactions given further. Second, assets purchased from Radha for rupees 12,000 on credit. What have you purchased? An asset. From whom? Radha. On credit. The amount is not paid. Yes, of course this is a credit transaction, but before that it is economic transaction because the monetary value of the transaction is 12,000 rupees. Asset is purchased from Radha. Just because this is the credit transaction, the relation of debtor creditor will arise. Who is Radha? She is a creditor because an asset has been purchased from Radha and the amount is not paid right now. The asset is purchased on credit. Yes. So again, economic transaction and the reason, relation of debtor creditor. The next transaction, it says asset sold for rupees 20,000. An asset is sold for rupees 20,000. What is sold? An asset. What is received? Cash. Economic transaction. 20,000 is received. Now you might question that, ma'am, there is nothing like that written in the transaction that cash is received. Remember, when nothing is mentioned, it clearly indicates that cash is received. Yes? Okay? Fine then. This is also an economic transaction. Let us read the reason for this. Cash is received against asset. An asset is given and in return cash is received. Alright? Fine. Talking about the fourth transaction in your textbook, illustration 1 that we are doing, in that fourth transaction, assets sold to Meera on credit for rupees 22,000. Asset has been sold to Meera on credit for rupees 22,000. Asset is given, amount will be received from Meera. How much? 22,000. So what is the economic value of the transaction? 22,000, of course. So again, this is economic transaction and also a credit transaction. The reason being relation of debtor creditor. Yes, who is Meera? Meera is a debtor in this case. Meera has not paid rupees 22,000. She will pay. So she is a debtor. Yes. If you have purchased on credit, the other party is creditor, and if you have sold on credit, the other party is a debtor. Alright. Fine then. Moving ahead towards the fifth transaction. It says rupees 8,000 paid for wages. You have paid, yes, rupees 8,000. You have paid in the sense you are the owner and you have paid. You just have to assume that, right, for clear understanding. It makes things easy to understand if you consider it personally. Yes. So you have paid rupees 8,000 for wages. Wages. What is wages? I have explained this in chapter 1. This is an amount paid for the service provided by the other person. How much have you paid? 8,000. For what you have paid? Wages. This is the cash transaction of service. Firstly, it is economic transaction. What is the economic value? 8,000. Yes. So this is again an economic transaction of business. Yes. Let us read its reason. Cash paid against service. You have received a service and you have paid cash in return for the same. Yes? Fine. Then, moving ahead with the sixth transaction, rupees 9,000 received for rent. You have received rupees 9,000 for rent. What is received? An amount. How much? 9,000. For what? For rent. Yes. So this is again an economic transaction. What is the monetary value of the transaction? 9,000. Yes. Let us read its reason. Cash received against service. Yes. Then, talking about the next transaction, liability of 15,000 is settled. What is a liability? Amount payable. Anything that you are supposed to pay is a liability. How much you are supposed to pay? 15,000. This is the transaction, cash transaction of payables. If you remember the previous lecture clearly, yes, all these points we have understood well in detail, and the transactions related to all those points are here one by one. You were supposed to pay 15,000 and you have paid it now. Liability is settled means liability is paid of rupees 15,000. Yes. Again, this is an economic transaction. Yes. What is the economic value of the transaction? 15,000. 18,000. Fine. Reason says liability is paid in cash. Okay. Next, receivable of 18,000 is received. You were supposed to receive 18,000 from a person and you have received it now. This is the cash transaction of receivables. Again, the same point under the category of cash transactions. Cash transactions, there were 4 points. This is the last point, the cash transaction of receivables and payables. Yes? So you were supposed to receive 18,000. This transaction is the cash transaction of receivables. Yes? You were supposed to receive 18,000 and you have received it now. Yes? So this is again an economic transaction because 18,000 the economic value, monetary value of the transaction. Yes? Fine. Receivable is received in cash. Okay? Then, ninth transaction, an order is received to supply goods of rupees 10,000. Understand? You have just received an order of rupees 10,000 to supply goods. Only order is received. Goods are supplied. Is there any instruction for that? That the goods have been sold? No. So this is not an economic transaction. Yes? Because the transaction has not taken place yet. No doubt, the value is 12,000, but the transaction has not happened in actual. Yes? Still only the order has been received. Say for example, I have received an order. You have received an order. Yes, that you should supply goods of rupees 12,000. So is this an economic transaction right now? No. It will be an economic transaction when you will actually supply the goods as per the order. So this is a non-economic transaction. Yes? Let us read the reason for this. It is not cash nor establishes the relation of debtor and creditor, and hence it is not an economic transaction. All right? Fine. 10th, a planning is made to buy one asset. Understand? You have just planned that you will buy an asset. Have you purchased an asset in real? No. You haven't purchased an asset. There is a lot of difference in planning things and actually implementing those things. And still you have only planned to purchase an asset, but you haven't purchased it in real. So this transaction cannot be considered an economic transaction. Yes? So this is a non-economic transaction. You can read the reason on your own. Let us move towards the 11th transaction and the last transaction of this illustration. To enhance sales. For discussion, a meeting is arranged with salesmen. You want to expand sales, and to discuss that matter, you have arranged a meeting. So there is no exchange of anything, nor any cash is involved, no money is involved, right? That's just a meeting that you want to increase your sales. Yes? Is this an economic transaction? Of course not. This is not an economic transaction. this is a non-economic transaction, and the reason being it's not a cash transaction, nor does it establish any debtor-creditor relationship. Is that clear? So with this, we are completely done with illustration 1, which was all about identifying a transaction, that whether it is economic transaction or non-economic transaction. All right. Further, the topic that we are going to study is about how to identify a transaction as a cash transaction or a credit transaction. In this illustration, the first illustration that we have understood, it says that how to recognize that whether the transaction is an economic transaction or non-economic transaction. The transactions are given related to that context. I mean, with that context it is given. Yes. And also the theoretical concept that we have understood previous to this illustration was all about it. That how do you find out, how do you understand, how do you recognize a transaction as an economic transaction? What are the points that highlight the transaction as an economic transaction? Yes. So illustration 1 was completely based on the same. Yes. The first chart that we have understood about business transactions, economic transactions and non-economic transactions. In economic transactions, we have understood about cash transaction, credit transaction and other transactions. So now the illustration that we are going to solve is about identifying transaction as a cash transaction or credit transaction, the second step, which was the first step, whether the transaction is an economic transaction or non-economic transaction. If it is an economic transaction, it is cash transaction or credit transaction, that you have to find out now. Yes. But I hope that you were clear with illustration 1. Firstly, you should understand whether the transaction is economic transaction or non-economic transaction. The thing should not be like that you will categorize a transaction as a credit transaction or cash transaction, but actually that transaction is non-economic transaction. You get me? That should not be the case. Firstly, you should be aware of the fact that yes, this is an economic transaction. So further, it can be cash, credit or other transaction. Yes, you cannot highlight a non-economic transaction as cash transaction or credit transaction. Yes, fine. So please understand the basic difference first and only then move ahead step by step. All right, fine then. So the important topic to be studied now is identification of cash and credit transaction. You have learned about identification of economic transaction and non-economic transaction. Now you are going to understand about cash transaction and credit transaction. Yes. So let us begin. Fine. So we are done with illustration 1, which you will surely practice once we are done with this lecture. Yes. And now let us understand how to identify a cash and credit transaction. Okay, so several important points to be considered, to be kept in mind while identifying a cash or credit transaction are that in the given transaction, if any of the words like cash, credit, understand, cash, sorry, not credit, what I'm talking. The words like cash, bank, check, received, paid, etc. These type of words usually, when they appear in the given transaction, that transaction is always a cash transaction. Yes? Going in detail on page number 27, identification of cash and credit transaction. Cash transaction, they say in this kind of transaction there is an exchange through cash or bank. Yes? See, if you have purchased goods from someone, you will pay the amount for purchase on the spot in cash. Either you will pay through check. Yes, both of them is considered to be a part of payment. So, both of them are to be considered as cash transactions. Okay? So, cash and bank, exchange through cash or bank. In such transaction, the word cash is mentioned. The word cash is mentioned in the cash transaction. If the word cash is not mentioned and the name of the other party is also not mentioned, then also that transaction becomes a cash transaction. I'll give you the examples for its better understanding, all these points. Third point, in this transaction, bank or cash account is definitely affected, and consequently bank and cash increases or decreases. This also you will understand while solving the practical examples for sure. But for now, let us understand these points. The first point says there is an exchange through cash or bank. Consider the simple example. Purchased goods of rupees 10,000 for cash. Yes, goods are purchased, cash is given. Cash transaction. Yes. Goods of rupees 10,000 are purchased and the payment is made through check, made through bank. This is also a cash transaction. The exchange of goods has taken place through bank. Previously it was through cash. So the first point is covered. Second point, they say in a cash transaction there is always a mention about the word cash. Yes. So goods of rupees 5,000 sold for cash. Cash transaction, of course, because the word cash is mentioned. But sometimes they say that in case, if in the given transaction the word cash is not mentioned and also the name of any other party is not mentioned, that means the debtor or creditor relationship creating sort of transactions, you might think that, ma'am, if it is not cash transaction, definitely it is going to be a credit transaction if the word cash is not mentioned. No. If the word cash is not mentioned and also the name of the other party is not mentioned, that means in absence of any information, it is always considered to be a cash transaction. You will understand this while solving an illustration with the same context. Okay? And third and last point says that the amount of cash or bank increases or decreases. If you will pay, it will decrease. If you will receive, it will increase. Yes, depends upon the type of transaction. If it is about sales, you will receive an amount, so cash will increase. If it is about purchase, if you will purchase something, then obviously you are going to pay for the same. During that time, the amount of cash decreases. Yes, fine. So this is all about the recognition of a cash transaction. Yes, that how do you recognize a cash transaction? Yes, mostly these type of words are mentioned in it. The word cash is mentioned. If it is not mentioned, and also the name of the other party is not mentioned, then it is to be considered as a cash transaction always. The exchange can be with cash or bank. The words such as check, received, paid, anything that paid wages of rupees 8,000, this is cash transaction. The word paid. Yes. So this is how you recognize cash transactions. Now let us talk about credit transactions. Yes. All right. How do you recognize a credit transaction? Pay attention. Okay. There is no exchange through cash or bank. Obviously, because the payment is not involved at that moment itself. The payment is delayed. So obviously there is no mention about cash or bank. The exact opposite point to the previous points related to the identification of cash transaction. Yes. Secondly, there is emergence of relation of debtor and creditor. Let us understand this point with the help of an example. Ramesh has purchased goods of rupees 10,000 from Mahesh. Is there any mention about the word cash or bank? No. Is there any other detail which highlights that this transaction is a cash transaction? No. Yes. It simply says that Ramesh is a person who has purchased goods of rupees 10,000 from Mahesh. Did he pay? Is there any mention about this? No. But that does not mean that Ramesh is not going to pay at all. He'll pay, but later or not right now, because it is not mentioned. And when he'll pay, it depends upon the credit time period allowed by Mahesh. So this transaction firstly is a credit transaction. Yes. And it results into the creation of debtor creditor. Debtor creditor relationship. Now there are two parties. You just need to clearly understand in your mind who is a debtor and who is a creditor. Who has purchased goods? Ramesh. From whom? Mahesh. Yes. So Ramesh is supposed to pay Mahesh. Yes. So for Ramesh, Mahesh is the creditor. And Ramesh is debtor for Mahesh. So in entire case that we have understood here, Ramesh is the debtor, Mahesh is the creditor. Ramesh is supposed to pay Mahesh. That is why Mahesh is the creditor for Ramesh, and Mahesh is supposed to receive from Ramesh, and that's why Ramesh is a debtor for Mahesh. Yes. So as I said, the credit transaction gives rise to the creation of debtor-creditor relationship. Yes. The last point, it definitely affects the account of a person. Just like in the cash transaction, the single effect, cash transaction will definitely affect cash or bank account compulsorily. Similarly, the credit transaction will always affect the account of a person for sure and always. Yes. So the last point, it says that the name of the party with which or with whom the transaction has taken place will always be given in the transaction, and it will always be affected. Yes. In cash transaction, always the cash or bank account is affected for sure. So in credit transaction, always the account of a person will be affected. The person can be the party with whom the transaction has taken place. The transaction can be of purchase, it can also be of sales, of anything. But the only point is that it will affect the account of a person. Yes. So in today's lecture, we have understood about the identification of cash transaction and credit transaction. We have also solved illustration 1 on the basis of the explanation of previous lecture about the business transactions, economic transaction and non-economic transactions. The theoretical lecture, it was the previous one. Yes. On those basis, we have solved an illustration, the first illustration of chapter 2 about identification of economic transactions and non-economic transactions. Yes. Further to that, we have understood the identification of cash transaction and credit transaction. Yes, that how do you identify a transaction to be cash transaction or credit transaction? Which are the points that you are supposed to keep in your mind for the identification of cash transaction and credit transaction? Yes, these points are clearly given in your textbook just after illustration 1 on page number 27. The points for identification of cash transaction, and the very next page has the points for identification of credit transaction. Yes, you should read them all in detail. Firstly, you should pay attention in this lecture. That means when you watch this lecture, your 100% concentration should be here. Yes, your mental, physical existence should be all together in watching this video lecture. Yes, so here we end this session for today, and in the next session we are going to solve illustration 2, of course, based on the explanation of identification of cash transaction and credit transaction. This was the second lecture for chapter 2. Yes. And in the third lecture of this chapter, we are going to solve an illustration. So, you should surely watch lecture 2 before you proceed with lecture 3 of chapter 2. Yes? So, we'll end this session here today. Till then, please stay home, do not move out unnecessarily and study well.